Sir, protecting vulnerable adults treads a fine line between respect of dignity and compassion for the vulnerable. The Vulnerable Adults Act is a timely and necessary creation to address the needs of a rapidly aging population and to bolster our existing legal frameworks. We have spoken much about bold ideas, but less about real action. This is an example of a small but significant change that we can make, a change that is literally a matter of life and death for thousands of older Singaporeans. The urgency and scale of the problem cannot be denied. By 2030, over 900,000 residents in Singapore will be aged 65 years and above, and an increasing number will be living alone, from 31,200 in 2012 to 83,000 in 2030. So I believe the number of adult abuse and neglect will increase going forward. The law as it currently stands is inadequate insofar as the state lacks the authority to intervene. For example, the state has been unable to enter the homes or to render timely assistance to vulnerable adults who might be abused by their caregivers or are in a serious state of self-neglect if the owner of the home refuses them permission to enter. The case of Madam E, a 79-year-old single woman who lives alone, shows us this in real life. She is mentally incapacitated, schizophrenic, and she has no next of kin. She rebuffs all attempts at treatment and intervention from healthcare professionals and social workers alike. Meal delivery services were also ignored as Madam E, she would leave undelivered meals at her gate. Hence, the risk of self-neglect is very high. Mentally ill elderly who live alone, such as Madam E, are prone to untreated falls and illnesses and may not have ready access to food. Another case shows how timely this proposed act is. Mrs. A. She is an 81-year-old woman suffering from dementia and incapable of activities of daily living. She was abused physically, emotionally, and psychologically by her 87-year-old husband, who himself is prone to violent outbursts. They used to stay together alone and away from their adult children. But their children's fear of the father made them unable to supervise the elderly couple, leaving Mrs. A without any protective figures at home. The new act allows for such cases of self-neglect and abuse, which usually also involve uncooperative or non-communicative vulnerable adults, to be addressed efficiently without the need for lengthy and unproductive negotiations with either the aggressor or the victim. Assessments of mental capacity can be enforced, the power of entering a vulnerable adult's premises can be exercised, and most importantly, there is a power to remove the vulnerable adult from the premises and to a safer place. This act allows us to act preemptively to protect vulnerable adults against caregiver abuse, neglect, and victim self-neglect. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I want to point out a few ways in which I believe we can make this act better. What is missing from this act? My first suggestion is to implement a mandatory reporting system for all stakeholders involved in providing care and services for vulnerable adults. Stakeholders such as medical and social workers, the AIC, the police, and perhaps even finance professionals. They could be legally obliged to report suspected abuse as long as they have reasonable grounds to believe that a vulnerable adult has been neglected or abused. The underlying principle is that with a group of people as vulnerable as those considered here, those who are unable or unwilling to voice their pains, worries, and concerns, it is wiser to be wrong than sorry. It is better, in my opinion, to err on the side of caution because underreporting of abuse is likely to be the norm. The difficulty, as is always the case, lies in the details. Who is required to report? Do we restrict the obligation to care professionals, or should we include neighbors, friends, and family members? What about finance professionals? Which types of abuse must be reported? Should less tangible forms of abuse, such as psychological and emotional abuse, be covered? Would it be overly onerous to penalize a third party for non-reporting of such less tangible abuses? And what about financial abuse, which my fellow parliamentarian, Mr. Luis Ng, just talked about just now? What sanctions will be imposed for failing to report? Taking into account the bystander effect, that witnesses of abuse are more reluctant to shoulder the burden of reporting if there are other witnesses. Lessons can perhaps be drawn from overseas jurisdictions. Washington has a mandatory reporting requirement in cases of elder financial abuse to relatives, friends, and neighbors, though relatives, friends, and neighbors are exempted from this obligation. Likewise, the state of Illinois, they impose an obligation to report on. It includes employees of the state of Illinois who provide medical or rehabilitation services to adults, law enforcement officers, and social service workers to guard against elder financial abuse. More fundamentally, we must strike an acceptable balance between protection and intrusion into personal affairs, taking into account Singapore's cultural norm of non-interference. It is my view that the Act, which already protects whistleblowers, can be tweaked to include mandatory reporting and yet protect these stakeholders from liability arising from provision of such information or breaches of any code of professional conduct. Penalizing the willfully blind heightens stakeholder awareness of their ward's vulnerabilities and improves oversight over the welfare of vulnerable adults. The social need for adequate protection of the most vulnerable amongst us charges us with a moral duty to find this balance, regardless of how difficult it is. My second suggestion is to consider including financial abuse of vulnerable adults under the ambit of this Act. Fellow parliamentarians such as Dr. Lee Dee Neo, Ms. Chia Yong Yong, professors such as Professor Chan Wing Cheong, and NGOs such as AWARE, they have repeatedly raised this concern. And again, Mr. Luis Ng just raised this as well. As it currently stands, the proposed Act only includes physical, sexual, or emotional, psychological abuse. But financial abuse can be as devastating as other forms of abuse and neglect. They can also be precursors to physical abuse. As AWARE observes, financial abuse is, and I quote them, often accompanied by threats of physical violence and compounds the vulnerability of a victim to further abuse and neglect, unquote. Vulnerable adults, due to their physical or mental infirmness, they are less able to safeguard their financial security, or may be held hostage by their live-in caregivers, or lack the financial resources to take civil action. We are well aware of cases of over-trusting parents who part with their assets out of love for their children who subsequently forsake them, whether due to a lack of filial piety or disagreements in the family. Too many cases, and too many sad cases. Other cases include deceiving or coercing an elderly parent to sign a will or deed, or taking money from them without providing support in return. Furthermore, financial abuse is underreported due to its subtle, non-tangible nature. In fact, 1 in 3 cases of elder abuse involve financial abuse as well. This according to a 2014 study by TransSafe Center. Including financial exploitation under the definition of abuse in the Act would, I believe, be a good starting point in securing the financial interests of vulnerable adults. The definitions used in other jurisdictions, such as in New York, Washington, and Illinois, they can potentially be transplanted with modifications. Some U.S. states even go so far as to impose mandatory reporting obligation on professionals who are aware of elder financial abuse. In fact, this is not the first time that the financial interests of the vulnerable has been debated in this House. The Maintenance of Parents Act, passed in 1996 and amended in 2010, allows elderly parents who are unable to maintain themselves adequately to apply for an order to have their children sustain him or her financially. The Act tabled before us today gives us the opportunity to act more preemptively to treat the scourge of financial exploitation at its root. Instead of ensuring that the vulnerable receives financial maintenance after the act of abuse has taken place, isn't it more effective to remove the threat in the first place? Such preemptive action ensures that whatever financial resources that the vulnerable adult still possesses are not taken away by abusers. I have some points of clarification, and this pertains to the issue of costs. Who bears the cost of intervention under the Act? For example, who pays for the permanent care or relocating of the vulnerable adults? Would it be from the vulnerable adult CPF, or the abuser, or the government? I think this point was raised by the NUS Center for Biomedical Ethics, and I agree that some clarification would be good. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I've argued that there is a case to be made for mandatory reporting and the inclusion of financial abuse in the Act. As is often said, the society is judged by how it treats its weakest members. The Act, in combating the social ill of the abuse of vulnerable adults, not only meets the changing needs of Singaporeans, its aging population, falling birth rates, and elders who live alone, but it also affirms the values of the Singapore that we all know and are proud of. The Vulnerable Adults Bill must recalibrate our traditional aversion against interventionistic laws, against the reality of the everyday life of older Singaporeans on the ground. It should not be an obstacle against protecting the highly vulnerable, whether they be children or adults. Exceptions must be made where called for, and the welfare of vulnerable adults is one such instance. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I support the bill.